Today we are going to talk here about all the differences between the Greek gods and the Roman gods, which, believe me, goes far beyond just the name, even though nowadays a lot of people think that. And with good reason, right? Especially since that's even taught in schools. Many think Greek and Roman mythology are the same, but they're not. There are many differences, including their ages. For example, Homer's Iliad was written 700 years before Roman civilization. And so, even though Greek mythology came long before Roman mythology, it's important to make something very clear here, because people always say that the Romans copied the Greek gods, but that's not really the case. It's not, okay? Because even before the arrival of Greek stories in Rome, the Roman gods already existed. Juno, Mars, Jupiter were already there. But the Romans, instead of focusing on the stories, focused more on their worship. They kept worshiping their gods. And even if you stop to think about it, after the arrival of Greek mythology in Rome, the Romans took and adapted the Greek stories to their own gods. Roman mythology itself still continued. It remained quite different from Greek mythology because the Romans didn't just adapt Greek mythology, they adapted several mythologies, like, for example, the Egyptian one. So of course the gods are not going to be exactly the same. And we also have the stories. There are stories that exist only in Greek mythology, and there are stories that exist only in Roman mythology, like, for example, the main ones. The Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer are from Greek mythology, and the Aeneid by Virgil is from Roman mythology. The story of Romulus and Remus, who are the two guys that founded Rome, is from Roman mythology. And in the case of this story here about Mars founding Rome, there's no doubt that it's Mars. Ares is different, especially because the Romans would never make Ares, who always lost in Greek mythology, their ancestor. There, his father. Well, another thing is that the Greeks believed the gods were unreachable and that they could never reach them. They, unlike the Romans, who believed they should be strongly inspired by the gods and try to be like them. The Romans firmly believed in an afterlife, which they thought affected what happened after death. Like, it's not that the Greeks didn't believe in life after death, but let's say they had different levels of belief. The Greeks were much more somber, and the Romans believed that the gods were examples to be followed during their lives. Now let's discuss the differences between the gods, starting with Apollo. It's interesting that I'm making a video about Greek and Roman mythology differences, because in the case of Apollo, he is one of the few, if not the only god, whose characteristics change very little from one mythology to the other. I won't say he's the only one, since someone might mention the god Blikudiko, who also doesn't change. Still, he's one of the few whose traits change very little. In fact, the name is shared in both mythologies, right? Greek and Roman mythologies usually have different names, but Apollo is the same in both. However, there are differences, such as Apollo's role in Greek mythology. He was the god of music, the god of the lyre, the god of the sun, the god of youth, the god of the bow, the god of the arrow, the god of plagues, and, in the case of being the god of plagues, he even had an epithet for that, Ekabolos, which means something like the one who shoots from afar. He descended from the peaks of Olympus, his heart full of rage, his arrows rattling on the shoulders of the angry god as he moved. First, he struck the mules and the swift dogs, but then he released a bitter arrow against the men themselves and wounded them. And although both in Greek myths and in Rome the connection between healing and Apollo exists, interestingly, the first worship of Apollo in Rome, it is when he saves them from plagues, being Apollo the healer. In the year 433 before Christ, a plague devastated the city. The people, by order of the Sibylline books, promised a temple to Apollo and performed rituals for the god so that he would divert the plague from Rome. And something that happens only in Rome is that Apollo was directly connected with Emperor Augustus. In fact, one thing about Augustus is that they say he became emperor because of Apollo himself. The very god of Actium, Apollo, looking down from above, was drawing his bow. Faced with this terror, all of Egypt and India turned their backs, fleeing. Caesar Augustus himself receives the gifts from the peoples and places them on the columns of Apollo's temple. And another curious thing is that when we say Apollo is a sun god, many people insist Helios is the sun god instead. But they're actually wrong about that, yes? Because both Apollo and Helios are, in fact, connected to the sun. One thing that happens in Rome is that there is the so-called unconquered sun. When Emperor Aurelian came to power, he was kind of a guy who ended up really pushing this deity. That's because he even made Sol Invictus an official state religion of the empire. And in this Sol Invictus, they kind of merge both Helios and Apollo with other sun-related deities, like Mithras. Something that doesn't happen in Greece is that Apollo and Helios are very distinct. The Romans actually connected Apollo to the sun, so much so that they said he was the one who carried the chariot. There is no doubt that Apollo and the sun are the same deity. The names given to them prove this. We invoke Apollo under the name of the sun when we want to refer to the power that illuminates the world. The sun we call Apollo, he said. If you can be dissuaded, stay away from my chariot, but if your heart persists, take the reins. And now let's talk about Hermes and Mercury, right? In Greek mythology, Hermes is primarily a god connected to nature, to herds, and also a trickster god, right? A deceitful god. In Rome, Mercury ends up being closely associated with profit and commerce. In fact, his name comes from the Latin marx, which means merchandise. We have this Homeric hymn from Greek mythology. Connecting Hermes to the fields and cattle, Apollo granted him the role of protecting herds and pastures, and Zeus made him his own herald. In the case of the Romans, we have this passage here focusing on his economic function, connecting him to merchants. O Mercuriali, to you, Mercury, the merchants offer incense and pray that you bring them profit and forgive the frauds committed in past deals. And even though these two here are very connected to the underworld, right? They are psychopomps, that is, guides of souls. The Greek Hermes has a strong, more mystical connection with the underworld, while Mercury, the Roman one, is seen as a messenger who carries out the orders of Jupiter. In all the realms, Hermes Sibylline called the souls of the suitors, and they followed him with screeches, like bats in a deep cave. The son of Maia, Mercury, obeyed the orders of the Great Father. He flies and cuts through the winds with his wings, bringing Jupiter's command across the sky. Hermes also wore a traveler's hat with wide brims called the Pitassos. In Rome, this hat evolved into a more stylized form, and it always appeared with much larger wings. This was to emphasize the speed of commercial exchanges. Another god we can talk about here is you. If you leave a like, do everything you already know you have to do, but especially if you become a member of the channel, which is less than 5 raised, and you help me a lot to keep working here, so we can have early access to videos and also exclusive videos like the ones showing up on the screen. Another way you can help me is by clicking on the products that are showing up on the screen. I'll even leave a PlayStation 5 there at a good price, but take advantage of it because I don't know how long it's going to last. Or by using the links in the comments. Just by using the links, you'll already be helping me. Now let's talk about Aphrodite and Venus. In Greece, the most famous origin of Aphrodite is that she is the daughter of Uranus. After he gets castrated there and loses his sac, she ends up being born in Rome. Although the myth is maintained, the focus is also more on her motherhood. In relation to the hero Aeneas, who is kind of the ancestor there, the ancestor of the Romans, which even makes her a direct ancestor of the Roman people and of Julius Caesar's family. The white foam arose from the mortal flesh, and from it a maiden was born. The name Aphrodite, the gods and men give her because it was in the foam, Aphros, that she was created. Venus, worried about her son Aeneas, begs Jupiter, "What end will you give, O king, to his suffering?" Jupiter answers, "Do not fear, Cytherea, you will see your son carried to the stars." Well, still in the Iliad, back in Greece, Aphrodite tries to enter the battlefield and is completely humiliated even by a mortal, Diomedes. And it's even ridiculous, and she's criticized by other gods, being called too weak for war. In Rome, she is often worshipped as Venus Victrix, or Victorious Venus, a deity who guarantees military victory. The son of Tydeus, Diomedes, leaped at the goddess and wounded her delicate hand. Mortal blood flowed, but God laughed and said, "My child, the work of war was not given to you. Take care only of the sweet things and the duties of love." Well, Pompeius and Julius Caesar dedicated the temple to Venus as the goddess who gave them victory in civil wars, something unthinkable for the Greek Aphrodite. Venus, victorious one, I dedicate this temple to you, for under your auspices the Roman army prevailed. Now, moving on to Minerva, to Athena, this one is actually pretty easy to separate. In fact, back in Greece, Athena is inseparably a goddess of war as well. Besides Ares, she is on the battlefield, she shouts for heroes. In Rome, Minerva lost almost all of her warlike aspect. Wow, I said that in a really normal way just now, but anyway, Minerva lost almost all of her warrior side. There, for the god, she basically became a goddess of wisdom, arts, and crafts. I sing of Pallas Athena, the terrible one, who is engaged in the works of war with the sacked cities and the battle cry. She sprang quickly from the immortal head, brandishing a sharp spear, and high Olympus trembled terribly at the power of the gray-eyed goddess. Well now, already in Rome. The video shows that the goddess does not work exactly with her hands, but rather with the mother, and not with the sword. Now, Minerva, it's your turn. Uncle Tessalon owes his craft to you and the spinner, her wool. You teach how to use the iron comb. Whoever wants to learn the liberal arts, let them come and worship Minerva. Besides, there's a really cool story about Athena, which isn't exactly about Athena, but rather about Minerva. It's the story of Arachne, where she loses a weaving challenge and is turned into a spider. That story exists only in Rome, not Greece. Greece. Hera is the wife of Zeus, and is often kind of humiliated by him, right? Because of his betrayals, and she even acts behind her husband's back. In Rome, Juno is the queen of the capital. That is, Juno Regina, a figure of state authority who rules alongside Jupiter as an institutional equal. Don't you remember when I hung you up high with 2 anvils tied to your feet and unbreakable gold bands on your hands? And the gods on high Olympus were outraged, but they couldn't set you free. O Juno Regina, who dwells on the Capitol, to you the Roman people dedicate this temple and beg you to preserve our republic and bring victory to our legions. Hera has a daughter, also named Aletheia, who takes care of childbirth. In Rome, however, Juno herself takes on this role directly as Juno Lucina, the one who brings the light, to be the deity closest to the daily life of every Roman woman. Hera is the mother of Aletheia, the goddess who brings the pains of childbirth. Hera keeps her in Olympus to delay the birth of Heracles. Well, in Rome, each woman kind of had her own Juno, a sort of personal protective spirit. Just like men had their genius, and a woman had to let her hair down in the temple of Juno, Lucina, not before offering a prayer for her childbirth to be quick and safe. Under the light of the goddess, Hera also ends up using war and monsters to pursue the bastards of Zeus. Juno, in Rome, especially as Juno Sospita, is depicted wearing a goatskin, shield, and spear. Acting as the active military protector of the city of Lanuvium and of Rome, Juno Sospita is depicted with a spear in hand and a shield, wearing curved shoes, ready to defend her people against any invader. Now let's talk about Neptune and Poseidon. Well, Poseidon was originally not just a god of the sea, he was also a god of the earth's depths and of earthquakes. As for Neptune, before the Greek influence, he was an Italic god of fresh waters and irrigation, which was essential for agriculture and survival there in the Roman Empire. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, and it split open. The king of the underworld himself jumped from his throne at the trident, fearing that the earth-shaker would break the ground and reveal the terrible mansions to the immortals. Well, Rome. The festival of Neptune, Neptunalia, took place at the height of summer, not to celebrate the sea, but to ask that the water sources would not dry up. We celebrate Neptunalia under huts made of branches, so that the god of waters protects our fields from the heat of Sirius and keeps the streams flowing. And Poseidon is also quite a vengeful god. He ended up kind of harming Odysseus for quite a long time. Neptune, in Roman literature in the Aeneid, is a figure of order who calms the storms to allow Rome's destiny to be fulfilled. But Poseidon, the earthshaker, did not cease his fury against the divine Odysseus and sent a terrible storm to shatter his raft, for the hero had blinded his son, Polyphemus. Neptune raised his calm head above the waves, and with words calmed the swollen sea, driving away the clouds and bringing back the sun. He is the Lord who imposes silence on the calm. For the Greeks, Poseidon's sea was a place of shipwrecks and constant danger. For the Romans, Neptune's sea was the Mare Nostrum, or our sea. Neptune was the god who cleared the way for the Roman fleets. After the victory at Actium, Neptune's name was exalted, for he bent the waves for Caesar's galleys and sank Egypt's hopes. Well, I spoke here, right? Several times I've said that Neptune is a calmer god compared to Poseidon, but there's a very famous story that people often blame on Poseidon, but actually, it's Neptune. It's the story of Medusa, where they say she was a beautiful woman, but then Poseidon ended up forcing her to do some things in Athena's temple, and Athena ended up turning her into that monster because of Poseidon. But actually, this story, or rather this version of the story, is Roman. It was Neptune who did that. But in Greece, Medusa slept with Poseidon because she wanted to, and she was already a monster. Hades, back in Greece, was a dark and rather frightening figure, let's say. The name Hades was avoided by people in prayers and in daily life. People would even knock on the ground to get Hades' attention, but they would look away. For the Romans, though, they kind of used a Greek epithet, right? Pluto would mean wealth, as the main name of their deity, focusing on what the soil offered. For him, Hades is relentless, inflexible, and that's why he is the most detestable of all the gods. For mortals, the underworld was dedicated to Pluto. All the power and substance of the earth belong to him, and that's why he is called Ditrico. For all things fall back to the earth and arise from it. Hades also focuses on retention. His main function is to ensure that no one leaves his realm. Pluto, in the Roman view, takes on a role more focused on merit and justice, almost like the administrator of a great estate. Hades, keeper of the earth's key, never lets souls who enter his realm return to sunlight. Pluto presides with justice, and before his throne, the shades receive what they deserve for their lives. He is not a tyrant, but a strict judge of natural law. Well, there's also the version of how Hades takes Persephone, which is a bit different from how Pluto takes Proserpina. But first, we're going to talk about Zeus here. Well, in Greece, Zeus is the god of lightning, which is a weapon of destruction and personal power. In Rome, Jupiter's lightning is more like an instrument of legal sanction, so to speak. And Jupiter doesn't just throw lightning bolts, he uses them to validate decisions of the Senate and state rituals. I am the strongest of all. Hang a golden rope from the sky, and all of you, gods and goddesses, try to pull me down. You won't succeed. But if I decided to pull, I would lift the earth itself and the sea with it. If I intentionally deceive, may Jupiter expel me from my home and my homeland, just as I throw this stone far from me. Whereas in the case of the Aesir, he's kind of a general god of thunder, right? Both during the day and at night. There in Rome, actually, we also had the human god, who was a god of nighttime thunder, while Jupiter took care of the daytime thunder. And now, going back to the story of Persephone and Hades, Zeus ends up giving Hades permission to kidnap Persephone. In Rome, we have a slightly different version. There, in addition to Venus and Cupid also helping Pluto in this story, Pluto ends up threatening Zeus, saying that if he didn't give Proserpina to him, in fact, if he didn't let him have Proserpina, he would even go as far as to free the Titans. Against Olympus, Pluto shouted from his dark throne. Why does Jupiter possess the sky and Juno's flowers, while I remain without heirs in the shadows? If I am not given a wife, I will break Saturn's chains and betray the Titans. Back in the light, Jupiter, fearing war, called Venus to devise a plan. Now, in the case of Ares and Mars, perhaps this is the greatest difference between the mythologies. Well, in the case of Ares, he was seen as a destructive and unstable force. Even the gods themselves kind of left him aside and despised him. Now Mars. In Rome, he was the father, Mars, as the progenitor of Romulus and Remus, and by extension of all the Roman people. Don't sit next to me to whine, you two-faced liar. Of all the gods who live on Olympus, you are the most hated by me because nothing is dear to you except discord, war, and battles. Mars puts down his shield and spear for a moment. You are the father of our city. It is only right that we dedicate the first month to you, for from you descends the lineage that raised these walls. Ares represented the frenzy of battle, the spilled blood, and terror. Mars represented virtues, civic courage, the strength needed to maintain peace and the security of the state. There was Ares, the terrible one, insatiable for war, holding a spear in his hand and inciting the soldiers. He was covered in blood, as if he were killing living men, and terror followed him. See how the father Mars marks with his own honors. Under his auspices, illustrious Rome will extend its empire to the ends of the earth and its virtue to the heavens. Guys, another thing too that, well, Mars, since he was a god, maybe even a main one, at a certain point there in Rome, he represented not only war, but also agriculture and the protection of the land itself, something that Ares never did. Father Mars, I beg you. Keep away visible and invisible diseases, sterility and destruction. Allow the fruits, the grains, the vines, and the bushes to grow and prosper. Also keep the shepherds and the cattle safe. Ares was also often defeated and humiliated because of his lack of strategy, something that Athena had, right? Mars is the personification of military discipline, the god who marches, Mars Gradivus. Ares was an individualistic, bloodthirsty, hated god, focused on conflict for the sake of conflict. Mars was collectivist, focused on the state's military war, protector of agriculture, loved as a father, focused on victory and the protection of order. Mars even became part of the main trinity of state gods, called the Archaic Triad, which was Mars, Jupiter, and Quirinus, by the way, a god who never existed in Greece, who symbolized the Roman state. There were also gods from him unknown in Greece. For example, as I mentioned, Simonis and Janus, the god of doors who opened the way. If you've watched the video up to this point, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and also like and share, and I'll see you next time.